Welcome to a brand new episode of Seize the Moment podcast. Today we have a very special guest. We have Robin Reames. She's Associate Professor of English at the University of Illinois at Chicago, specializing in rhetorical theory and history of ideas. Her books include Seeming and Being in Plato's Rhetorical Theory and the Rhetorical Tradition, readings from classical times to the present, which was co-authored with Patricia Bizzell and Bruce Herzberg. And her new book, coming out on March 19th, is called The Ancient Art of Thinking for Yourself, The Power of Rhetoric in Polarized Times. Welcome, Robin. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And so just, before I read a passage from the book, we were saying before, when we were talking before filming, so we've never had on somebody who's actually an expert in persuasion. Like, we usually talk about the science of debunking, normally why people fall for conspiracy theories, sort of different kind of avenues and different ways to challenge them. But I'm assuming this is going to be a way more in-depth conversation than we've had so far. So Robin wrote in her book, I was raised to be a Republican housewife. This may sound strange to you if you weren't born into a particularly political or religious household, but for people who grew up in the world like the one I come from, white, evangelical, Christian, Southern, it was pretty normal, or at least typical. Religion and politics were indistinguishable from one another, and we were taught that a conservative point of view was the only right position to have in either realm. If Jesus could have voted, he would have been a far right Republican, and only far right Republicans truly love Jesus. Oh, that's, yeah, tautological. Oh, so my dad was especially determined to teach us the right way to think about pretty much everything, from politics to pop culture, theology to fashion trends. Clearly, as we'll see, both needed a little help in the fashion department. Conservative conversations at dinner consisted of him telling us what was wrong with the world and us correctly repeating his arguments back to him. But for me, it consisted of trying to find flaws or inconsistencies with his arguments and pointing them out to him. This might sound miserable to you, but believe it or not, I loved arguing with him. He liked it too. He loved watching me test my counter arguments and debate tactics. When I was younger, he could always defeat my contradictory positions. But over the years, my oppositional instincts sharpened into reasonable arguments that tended to frustrate him. So this is super interesting. And it sounds like from what you're saying here is that he loved kind of going at it as though, let's say, I don't know, an uncle would, this is a hypothetical. I mean, this technically actually happened with me. As though an uncle were teaching a 9-year-old to play chess. You know, you're like, hey, this is really nice. Like, I get to feel like I'm useful. And then also at the same time, I feel superior. So can you tell us a little bit about your background? What was that like? And what happened in your evolution of thought? And obviously how it affected your relationship with your dad?
Yeah, that was one of the major reasons. I agree with everything that you just read, by the way. But that was one of the major reasons and the inspirations for writing the book was, as you were just saying, a lot of the explanations for the kind of so-called post-truth era were just sort of ringing a little bit hollow for me. And they were ringing hollow for me, I think in particular, because I come from that world. I'm related to and still know a lot of people who have a tendency to believe misinformation and disinformation. And a lot of the explanations were sort of falling flat for me. So this way into the book was really sort of reflecting on my relationship with my father and how I came from a world that was steeped in perspectives that I would now consider to be really in error in so many ways. But at the same time, coming from that world, I think I understand it from the inside. And my explanation isn't people are stupid or they're like so simultaneously gullible and cynical at the same time that they'll believe everything and nothing at the same time. It's more complicated than that. And it has a lot to do with, as you were mentioning, it has to do with how persuasion functions and how language functions. And it can be language, builds a world for us that can be very hard to break outside of. And so I wrote this book in many ways as like a reflection, as you were reading, on this relationship with my father, which was sort of like a mirror for me of what was happening in the culture as a whole. When I was born, political polarization was at an all-time low. Now it's at an all-time high. And so in many ways, like the relationship with my father over the course of several decades, as my own mind was changing, served as a sort of reflection of what was happening in the culture as a whole. And so I wrote the book in part because of that, because of this relationship with my dad, because I felt like I had an explanation for people that can maybe help people understand how misinformation is so effective at persuading people without just sort of dismissing those people or diminishing or demeaning those people. There are reasons that their minds are so powerfully swayed. And a lot of that has to do with the language that persuades them. And if we look at the language, we can come to understand it better. But that part of that process is also understanding how we ourselves, even if we're not persuaded to believe misinformation, we're persuaded to believe things all the time, and the function is the same. So my book really wants to kind of unpack that for people who have never read about rhetoric in the past, or don't know anything about it. This is sort of an introduction to that discipline and its ability to kind of reveal those powerful facets of language, and at the same time to kind of offer people a way of reflecting differently on what's happening in our political culture.
Mm-hmm. And so what was it like with your father when he became frustrated and you guys finally started clashing about the different perspective or
It
different
wasn't
views?
pretty.
Yeah.
It wasn't pretty. It was never, I think when I was still very much like in the fold,
Mm-hmm.
there was a sort of playfulness to it. And I think part of that was, I think there, as parents, we all have like some pleasure when we watch our children kind of developing their intellectual instincts and sharpening their minds. And so I think there was some aspect of that on my dad's part, and for me too, growing up. But then as I got older and as I started to kind of, my mind was kind of carrying me away from the culture that I was raised in. My reading and my learning and my thinking were all kind of carrying me away from being kind of dogmatically in line with what I was supposed to be dogmatically in line with. It led to conflicts that became not fun and not playful. It became serious and it became pointed and personal. And I think, he was as frustrated with me as I was frustrated with him. We were both like we're irritants to each other. And on my part, I couldn't believe some of the things that he would send me emails asking me to watch or read or view. It just like would blow my mind that he would believe the things that he would believe. But at the same time, I was living in a different world. I was consuming different information from what he was consuming. And that's not to say that they were both equal. I don't believe that they were both equal. I don't believe the processes of attaining and understanding the information were both equal. But at the same time, like it led to our inability to kind of understand the world that he was living in and the world that I was living in. That disconnection between us led to a really fraught relationship later in his life. And I think if this book had been accessible to him or available to him, not written by me, but by somebody else, it's possible that we could have found at least more common ground or found a better way of talking about the things that we disagreed on, and at the very least understanding how powerful ideological thinking is, and maybe poking some holes in the power of ideological thinking, which is in many ways what the book is aiming to do, and helping readers see how ideology, as opposed to like practical, lived, actual, real, everyday experience, ideological thinking can color the way they experience the world.
Did you want to ask?
And yeah, I'm wondering, what kind of role does rhetoric play in terms of today's politically polarized climate? In what way do politicians or bad actors sort of use rhetoric in order to influence other people?
That's such a huge question. There's so many. Like the book is really aims to show, each chapter aims to show like a different way that rhetoric is at work. So I can give you a few examples, but I guess I would sum them up with a general statement, which is that one of the reasons they work so well is that we don't study rhetoric anymore. And so there's really almost an endless or bottomless list of rhetorical techniques and methods and tricks that people use in speech all the time, often without even knowing that they're using them. And that can account for the power and the persuasion and sometimes the deception and the manipulation that happens in political discourse and language. So I couldn't really say, here's the one and only or the top five, because there's just so many. I can point to a few that I talk about in my book, but I would sum it up by saying in the ancient world, when rhetoric was conceived at the beginning, and it started in the 5th century BCE in Greece, so a very, very long time ago, like two and a half millennia ago, the whole reason it came into being was the idea was if we study the way that persuasion works and we can develop a vocabulary to describe and explain how persuasion and manipulation occur in language, then we'll be able to spot it. And if we're able to spot it, if we have a vocabulary for it, we can name it, we can spot it, then we're not going to be as easily duped. We're not going to be as easily fooled. And that the practice and the study of rhetoric really continued uninterrupted in its study from that time until just about 100 years ago, when it more or less got replaced by writing. Once writing sort of replaced the study of speech and oral argumentation, then it came to be seen almost like a vestigial tale, and it sort of fell out of fashion. It fell away from our kind of sphere of attention. And so what I would say in general, in answer to your question, is that just studying rhetoric and studying not only a few, 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 techniques, but really every technique that every rhetorician has ever come up with, and there are literally thousands of them, helps us to spot those deceptions and understand how they work. But I can give you a few examples. Like one of the examples that I that's what you're asking for. Talk to an academic and they'll just give you the longest answer without answering.
Yeah, you can just keep going on. Keep talking. Yeah.
They're the worst. Yeah. I'll give you a few examples. One of the examples that I give comes from this ancient rhetorician named Alcidamas. He was a peer of Plato's in the 4th century. And he wrote this long treatise on those who write written speeches. And the whole upshot of the treatise was someone who writes a written speech, someone who delivers a written speech. And this was like new tech, right? This is almost like it's the equivalent today would be like somebody's complaining about people using AI to write their speeches for them. His argument was like, it actually sounds a lot like an argument against AI. It's like, it's not the living, breathing word of the person who's speaking. It's not them revealing themselves to their audience and being open and honest and true. A written speech can never fully be true because it's not the speaker revealing who they are for better or worse in all of their glory and all of their flaws to the people that are right there in front of them. So we have this disconnect today in rhetoric when we hear people like Donald Trump speak. And we've got people like some of my family members who listen to Donald Trump speak, and to them, Donald Trump is speaking God's truth. Like every word that comes out of his mouth has the ring of truth to them. Like it just sounds true and it feels true. And so therefore, for all intents and purposes, it is true. But for those of us who are stacking up Donald Trump's words against the reality that they supposedly represent, they're not true, they're lies. But if we look at this from the perspective of the rhetorical tradition and ancient rhetoric, we realize we're actually talking about 2 different concepts of truth. Donald Trump goes off script. He shoots from the hip, he speaks from the heart. Alcidamas would say he's speaking from the heart. And so in one sense, in an ancient sense, and in a rhetorical sense, in some ways he's telling the truth, or at least he is as far as his audience is concerned. And so if we're dealing with 2 different concepts of truth, it's not so much that we're disagreeing about his words, we're disagreeing about some underlying concept, and that is what we take truth to mean, not whether he's telling the truth, but what we take truth to mean, full stop. That's one example of how rhetoric can kind of open our eyes to show us something else is going on in the language than what we might first assume, or what on the surface it seems like is happening in the language.
Right. And I would just want to stick on that point. So it's interesting because I would say for the most part, and I mean, obviously, I think you would agree that truth seems to be self-evident. So what does that mean, I guess, to have, different constructs of truth? Because, Trump would say, well, there are alternative facts, which obviously most people wouldn't agree with. So what do you mean by different truths?
Well, so that's a great question. Truth is not self-evident to me, and I don't mean that what is true in the world is self-evident to me. I'm saying that the meaning of truth has developed historically over time. We don't think of it that way. We think of truth as something, as you said, we think of it as something that's so self-evident. We should be able to take it for granted. Like, what on earth do you mean? What does truth mean, right? And I'm not saying that as some kind of relativist who's like, oh, it's all relative, man. Like, that's not the point at all. The point is that when you pay attention to the concept of truth as it sort of migrated historically, and I'm not talking about the last 100 or 200 years, I'm talking about since the beginning of the rhetorical tradition, the inception in ancient Greece, over 2 millennia. If you track carefully what happened to truth, you can see how it changed drastically and radically over time. We think of things like fashion trends or modes of transportation changing all the time and not having a kind of fixed referent. Truth is actually the same. For the ancient Greeks, truth did not mean referring to something factually or accurately in the world. We think of truth in that referential way, that there's the language up here and there's the world below it, and the language is supposed to correspond accurately to the world below it. And if it does, it's true, and if it doesn't, it's false. But that meaning of truth really didn't have any kind of purchase for the ancient Greek rhetoricians. When they were thinking of truth, they were thinking of something as being disclosed or shown. And the opposite of truth wasn't falsehood. It was something being hidden from view, being tucked away or hidden away. So yeah, we have a sense, we believe today now that truth has a sort of self-evident meaning. But if you pay attention to how it developed over time, or how the concept of truth changed over time, it's clear that it doesn't have a self-evident meaning, at least not historically. It has a transformative meaning. It has a meaning that's evolving over time, historically speaking. But then when you look at those sort of phenomena that we see rhetorically in politics around us, you can actually see how these older meanings of truth, this idea of something being shown to us, disclosed to us, no longer hidden from view, still has a kind of power. I think that's what people respond to when they're responding to people like Donald Trump. It feels to them as though somebody's not hiding their words. They're not hiding their ideas. They're exposing them. They're showing them. They're disclosing them.
Oh, I
So yeah, I
understand.
think one of the aims of the book is really to get people to pay attention to what they're assuming about truth, rather than just taking it to be self-evident, as we're all inclined to do.
Right. So interesting. So, but I obviously, as a Republican, some person would say, well, like, I understand what you're saying. Obviously, there are these different concepts or constructs of truth, right? But Donald Trump really is telling the truth in the way that we think of truth. Like, how would you address that?
I mean, as a hypothetical, if Donald Trump is really telling the truth, I think we could then have a productive conversation about the fact that, yeah, Donald Trump is not hiding behind a written script. That Donald Trump is, for all intents and purposes, putting something on display for people in a way that feels like authenticity to them.
Right.
But it's important not to confuse authenticity with truth, with factual truth. We can have a good conversation about the difference between a kind of disclosing an authentic truth and a factual, accurate truth. And then maybe we could even potentially come to a set of agreements about certain things that Donald Trump has said and does say and continues to say that don't match up with reality, as opposed to a sense of truth that comes from the fact that he's speaking extemporaneously, that he's authentically revealing who he is, that it doesn't seem as though he's hiding.
Right.
It seems to me that like having a productive conversation of what we mean by truth is a preliminary to coming to some kind of understanding about whether or not somebody like Donald Trump is telling the truth.
Yeah, doesn't that suck, by the way? If somebody's just at least seems authentic, they're confident in what they're saying, they're aligned with their thoughts, words, and actions. You have people who buy into their ideas and kind of give authority by buying into that person. It almost kind of it kind of tells other people who aren't sure or they're on the fence, maybe this guy is telling the truth, or maybe we should buy into what it is that he's saying. And that kind of sucks about us as human beings, that if we just see that like if certain filters are sort of met, then that's it. This must be true. Like our brain just goes like, oh, unconsciously, this is right. And I don't know. That's why I really like what your book is talking about. At least then we can start to sort of detect, like what is it in their speech that's kind of manipulative? What is it that's there that like you could tell like, no, okay, let me be nuanced about this. Let me not necessarily take them at their word. Let me think about this an extra step. Right.
Yeah. But what's really
Yeah,
cool?
absolutely.
Go ahead, Robin.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead,
Oh,
Leon.
so yeah, I was gonna say, and what's what I really like? So the fact that we're even distinguishing the concepts of truth. So Alan and I, for a while would go, I don't want to say back and forth, but we would have, let's say, dialogues about Bobby Kennedy Jr. And so the interesting thing about Bobby Kennedy, so as much as I really dislike him, I gotta give it to him, man. He's been pretty consistent. So a lot of people him, Ron Paul, even Rand Paul, to be honest with you. So not Ted Cruz. I was actually gonna throw him in, but no, never mind. But all these other people like Robert Kennedy Jr. I mean, listen, man, they've kind of been saying the same stuff for years. So in some ways, there is a kind of truth there. It's not the truth that we think of, obviously, in terms of factual, in terms of just facts, right? In terms of a factual basis. But the point of the matter is, it's like they are speaking what they truly believe. And so, when What?
So wait, let me just add something very
Shoot.
quickly because I didn't expect we were gonna go there. So by the way, when I first started hearing about, RFK Jr., I'm like, okay, this guy seems interesting. There's people I like that like him. Oh, okay. And okay, he's related to the Kennedys. Okay, let me listen to him in a speech. Okay, he has this thing going on with his voice, but he sounds like a very genuine guy. I like him. I don't know where I start bringing that up to Leon, and then he's like, "Oh, wait, are you aware of his like beliefs on vaccines?" I'm like, "No, what's going on?" He's like, "Look, okay, here's this article, here's that article, here's
Yeah,
that."
we really went back and forth for a while.
No, no, and then so first I was like, because I didn't even do the research yet. At on the surface, first I'm like, "Oh, I'm sure he has a reason to be saying what he's saying." It doesn't mean I'm not going to critically think, but at that level in our stage of conversation, okay, like I'm starting to kind of unravel a little bit. Like at first, I'm on the surface a little resistant, and then he starts bringing in these facts. Okay, I read the articles and I'm like, shit, shit. Okay, shit. He's really hardcore anti-vax, and a lot of different vaccines, not just like,
Yeah, right.
whatever.
I mean, he really thinks that they cause autism. So yeah.
Right. So just wanted to add that little caveat
Right,
there
right, right.
because you just introduced that. It's like, me and Alan would have
Yeah, 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 yeah. I know. So Alan doesn't want to be mistaken for a fan. No, I hear you. But like, right. So, but really, so yeah, I hear you. But and my point in all of this is to say that I think it's a great segue to a conversation and noting the distinctions of truth. Because like, so I mean, I wonder, right? Actually, I'm going to pose you this question. So what if I told you like, hey, you know what? I respect Bobby Kennedy for like the fact that he's been consistent. Yes, when he goes like on Rogan or whatever, he like spouts these, let's say, data points or whatever, because he genuinely believes them, right? So I mean, it's not like it's a person who's just outwardly lying. Would you say that would have made it easier for you to kind of be like, oh, okay, you know what? Maybe I will look into some of the stuff that he's saying. I mean, I know you did anyway. But I'm just wondering if we went about it from that perspective.
I see. I see. So as if you were respecting my ideas,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
therefore our
Well, I saw
rapport is not destroyed. And then I'm like, okay, Leon seems to understand something about this. I'm going to listen to
right,
him.
right, right. It's not like I'm saying, oh, well,
Interesting.
Bobby Kennedy's like just
Sure.
huckster and he's full of shit. If I were to say like, well, I mean, I could understand that there's a version of truth here, but it's not exactly what you're thinking.
I mean, I
Well, I think
can't.
what you're referring to though is maybe it's a different concept than a version of truth. Like saying that somebody's consistent isn't quite the same thing as a historical notion of truth as revealing, and also like not the same thing as truth as factuality, but saying somebody's consistent or that they believe what they're saying is true.
Right.
It's a slightly different like grace that you can offer a person, I think, and it doesn't necessarily involve their own truth telling. I think, Alan, your bewilderment about somebody like Bobby Kennedy Jr. is very common for so many of us. I mean, there's too much information. There are too many sources of information. The differences between the types of sources where we get our information is flattened because of the screens, like literally flattened because of the screens through which we get that information. I mean,
Yeah.
there may be a difference between the New York Times and I don't know, Epoch Times, Epoch Times versus the New York Times versus actual scientific studies about vaccines published by experts. But as far as we're concerned, and from where we're sitting, it can be very hard to discern the difference for the typical user on the other side of the screen. So I think your experience that you recounted, like you hear him and somehow his words have a kind of power and they make a kind of sense, really just like a basic level of rhetorical training would have you tuned in and keyed in to what it is that's evoking that response. You'd be more aware of your own response to it and the relationship between the language that you're hearing and your tendency to believe it through some rhetorical knowledge. And so that really is like the starting place. Our natural tendency as human beings is to want to either agree or disagree, believe or disbelieve. That's a kind of automatic, reflexive, knee-jerk response we have to hearing arguments and language. But what rhetoric does is it just inserts a block there. And the block is like, why are they saying it this way? What's the effect of these words as opposed to other words? I'm noticing I'm having an emotional response to this language. What is it in the language that's making me have an emotional response? Why is it making me feel sad? Why is it making me feel angry? Why is it making me feel frustrated? Rhetoric prompts you to ask all those kinds of questions. So it just kind of introduces a synapse between your belief, your disbelief on the one hand, and the language on the other.
So I have to ask, and I apologize to our audience because I'm going to be super annoying, because I really want to know the distinction. So the version of truth that you're referring to, sort of bringing about something that I guess is hidden. So can you say a little bit more than that about that? Because I really do want to understand it.
Yeah, so it really just, I mean, I could get into the Greek for you, but it's going to be boring. But the term in Greek for truth, that we now translate and think of as truth, was aletheia, and
Mm,
it is not, and lethe is hidden. So something being unhidden and undisclosed. And they understood speech to really function that way. Anytime I'm putting something into words, I'm literally like bringing it before your mind, bringing it before your eyes. Even if you probably have noticed, like sometimes when people speak or when they tell a story, it's sometimes you can actually even visualize what they're saying as though it's playing out right in front of you, right?
mhm,
It's actually it's a neurological function that cognitive scientists now know why and how that happens in the brain. But as something ancient rhetoricians have understood from the beginning, that the way language works is it puts things out in front of us. It makes them be seen. It shows them. It shows the realities to us. So
mhm,
it was really just like a basic understanding of how language functioned, of how language worked. And that didn't mean that anything anybody said, anything anybody put in front of you was true. They also understood that sometimes somebody might put something in front of you so that you're not seeing something else, right? And that's a
right.
function of language as well. It's a subtle difference, but it's nevertheless a pretty remarkable one, a very different one from thinking of language as having a strict and direct referentiality or indexicality to the world, which is how we think of it now. And it requires just thinking a little bit imaginatively about why something being disclosed or being shown or being unhidden to us would count as truth in a way that's so different from how we think of it today.
Oh, because when you said it, I was thinking that you were mentioning that Trump was more authentic, or I guess maybe not more authentic, but highly authentic, which is what people kind of like. Because it seems like, at least from my perspective, that's what people seem to really like about him. Like, yeah, regardless of what he says, how he says it, or whatever, I think the idea is like, but he's speaking his truth. I think maybe that's the way it's framed. So that's why I assumed that you were kind of conflating the two together.
I'm not so much conflating them. I'm saying that what Donald Trump is doing by not using a written speech and by speaking the words that come straight to him is a kind of disclosure,
Mm,
right? It's not necessarily a disclosure or revealing that's accurately true or factually true, but it is a kind of revealing. It is a kind of putting himself out there, disclosing himself to his audience.
gotcha. Okay. Yeah. And then I want to kind of, since we were on the subject of Bobby Kennedy Jr., so there was something that Michael Shermer recently said about him, which I really liked, where he said that Bobby Kennedy, well, Kennedy Jr., but I sometimes call him Bobby Kennedy. He is not Bobby Kennedy. So the point is to say that, so Kennedy would frequently, so he said that for Kennedy is essentially a lawyer. He's like, listen, he's trained in the art of rhetoric. And the point is, he's not really going to give up. That's not what he's trained for. He's not like a necessarily a scientist or a truth seeker, even though he uses a lot of scientific jargon. So can you tell us about that? So like, how does that happen, right? So how is it that scientific jargon is used by, I'm going to use the term lawyer here for lack of a better term. I don't necessarily mean every lawyer obviously does this, but what I mean is that what happens is that you have somebody like a Bobby Kennedy Jr. who kind of co-opts scientific jargon, where he goes on the Joe Rogan and he says, well, just look at the data. And Rogan's like, yeah, no, wow, these sound like fascinating studies. And the thing is with Kennedy, I mean, listen, at least on the surface, he seems to read these studies and they seem to really, at least the way he describes it, the results seem to be pretty fairly, seemingly not just conclusive, but seem to be favoring his side. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Let's start with science. How have they co-opted science now to what's the word? Not persuade us, but like mispersuade us.
So I mean, if you're asking, let me like just ask a clarifying question. Is your question about why scientific, like when speakers use scientific language or they import evidence, so-called evidence from science into their speeches, that has a sort of powerful rhetorical effect?
Yeah, yeah.
Is
So
that
essentially,
okay?
how they do it? So like, what's really? I mean, it seems a little bit obvious, but I still want to get into it. So like, what's the technique, right? How did they kind of skew the data, and how did they use or have they co-opted scientific jargon in order, to obviously kind of in this case, what's the word? Let's say to support their own purposes.
Yeah. Well, so rhetoricians, and I'm thinking of a couple of rhetoricians in particular named Chaim Perlman and Lucy Obrecht-Titeka, who were working following the Second World War. They wanted to explain like how mispersuasion, as you put it, how mispersuasion happened that led to such disastrous wrong turns and decisions in the Second World War in Europe in the 20th century. And one of the things they noted was how fragile facts were in rhetoric. And facts in rhetoric actually function the opposite of how we would think they do, or how we assume they do in the world. Facts in the world are supposed to be kind of fixed and immutable. They're supposed to be non-malleable. They can't be just gainsaid and then they're false. Mm-hmm. But oddly, in rhetoric, the situation is actually the reverse. When facts are introduced into rhetoric, all that has to happen to essentially rob them or drain them of their status as a fact, as something fixed, as something known, as something certain, is just simply gainsaying them, just simply contradicting them. So that's one of the things I see in the vaccine debates is you have like the massive consensus of the scientific community and epidemiology. And then you have this one dude come along with his own set of facts to contradict the facts, right? And it's that quick. It's just the snap of a finger. It happens so quickly and so easily. So one of rhetoric's explanations is the reason it works so well, the reason that kind of scientific fact works so well is because what it's doing actually is just denying factuality. I mean, it sounds like it's establishing other facts, but really how it's functioning on a rhetorical level is just denying factuality. But another part of this has to do with something rhetoricians call ethos, which is like one of the rhetorical concepts that most people, if they've heard of anything having to do with rhetoric, they've heard of logos, ethos, and pathos, right? Mm-hmm. Logic, authority, and emotion. But one of the ways that rhetoricians will establish ethos is by projecting a kind of sense of expertise and knowledge. And that's happening not necessarily by gaining the expertise, for example, by, spending 10 years in graduate school and another, 3 years in a postdoc and then establishing your own lab and doing the actual research. Mm-hmm. You can actually, in rhetoric, just develop your ethos by using language that would suggest a kind of knowledgeability, that would suggest a kind of expertise. This actually goes back to something that Alan was bringing up, doesn't it suck about humans? Doesn't it suck about humans that we fall for this stuff? But in a way, yes, but also in a way, no, because it is possible for people to make the same kinds of rhetorical moves with actual expertise or with goodwill, right? Rather than with a cynical disregard for the truth or a cynical disregard for people. So yeah, yes and no. I mean, the fault is on us for not knowing how the tricks work, right? If once we know how the tricks work, like I was saying earlier, we're much less easily tricked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, especially now in modern day. I mean, pretty much the use of scientific jargon, it seems to be what's like the term? It's like I guess the purchase or whatever. I don't know what term to use here, but like pretty much it's pretty prevalent, the use of scientific jargon. So Brett Weinstein, who is now like I would say pretty relatively famous. I mean, he's reached I think like 1 million subscribers or 1 million followers, something like that. And so yeah, I mean, Weinstein is technically a trained biologist, and so is Heather Heyer. And so with them, I mean, what they do is they couch their theories in evolutionary theory. So even though it makes a lot of sense, well, they'll say something like, well, kind of evolution has adapted. Oh, I'm sorry, people have adapted due to evolution or due to natural selection. And let's say China, here's one example. So this was something along the line. I'm going to butcher it just to be clear, because I've read it a while ago, but he said something along the lines of like, well, so with China, evolution created in some ways this one child policy so that China could have more male soldiers and essentially so they could kind of like conquer the world or whatever it was that he said. So I don't remember exactly the argument, but the point is to say that it's always like that, or usually like that, where you do have somebody like a Bobby Kennedy Jr. or somebody like a Brett Weinstein who are not maybe necessarily, well, Weinstein, he is a professionally trained scientist, but with others, I mean, they're kind of like, they kind of know what they're talking about. And so because they feed you information that seems on the surface to be legitimate, and at least sometimes it comes from seemingly credible sources, that when they use science, it's so easy for the person to just like, you were saying, hey, like I listened to this stuff, it seems legitimate, it makes a lot of sense. Kennedy's obviously a very smart guy. So it's so easy to trick people when, again, you're using language that people learned in school, they hear every day, they hear from legitimate scientists, and then they're like, oh, hey, like Brett Weinstein is saying this stuff about evolution. Yeah, I remember learning about evolution in high school. So it's kind of interesting what they do. So it's not a complete departure from what we normally know. I mean, what they do is they kind of twist it, but they skew it in such a way that literally then kind of, if you take 2-3 steps forward, now you're at this whole other place. And now you're like, wait, hold on. We were just talking about evolutionary theory, and now we're talking about like fucking the deep state and whatever else. How did we even get here?
Yeah, I mean, what I was just explaining about the way that facts work is really a way of sort of trying to suggest that when you listen to rhetoric, like the rhetoric you're just summarizing there, it isn't sufficient just to think, oh, it makes sense, right? Or it makes sense on the surface, or they make a compelling argument. One of the things you want to look for is like what the ultimate aim is. And the aim isn't just to kind of independently establish an argument. The aim is actually to knock down an argument, right? The aim is to knock down the weight of scientific consensus on a question like vaccines. And if the aim is to knock it down, I mean, and I'm saying this not as an epidemiologist or somebody who studies vaccines. I'm saying this as somebody who studies rhetoric.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always keyed into and tuned into what the rhetorical aim is. And if the aim is ultimately to deny some other position, then I'm immediately on. My antenna are definitely up as a rhetorician, because I know that when someone denies a fact, when something denies a reality, when someone denies that something is the case, I'm aware that that actually is it's a very effective rhetorical tool that works like magic every time. And so I want to be immediately cautious of the fact that I'm being seduced into believing something that ultimately is a denial. And I know that denials have a lot of rhetorical power.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
it
and how
isn't like, I'm trying to suggest that like it isn't, you want to move away from saying, oh, an argument makes sense on its own or independently, and think, okay, what's the rhetorical aim? It's not just to make an argument, it's to deny another argument, right?
Yeah. And also, how interesting is it that it's usually a partial denial, where you have somebody like a Brett Weinstein who probably would say, well, he's like those spiritualists, those people who believe in like the reptilians or whatever, like those are the crazy ones, right? I'm an evolutionary biologist, so there's still some, let's say, there's some kind of like agreement with the consensus view, at least in that respect. It just kind of goes off its hinges when again, you're 2, 3 steps down. But again, it's super interesting how for a lot of conspiracy, some of them are purists, some of them are literally like, hey, we're anti-establishment, we don't buy evolution, we don't buy the Big Bang, like this is all garbage. I mean, these are mostly like the Christian type conspiracy theorists. But then yeah, you would still have somebody like a Brett Weinstein, who my understanding of it is, I mean, I could be wrong obviously, but I think he's still seeking acceptance in the establishment. So again, he takes some part of it, especially in relation to his training, but then again, he kind of veers away from it. So you're kind of wondering like, wait, okay, dude, are you anti-establishment or are you not anti-establishment? So you say evolution is true, but then you're saying here are the parts of it that I don't agree with, or here are the parts that like academia is missing or whatever, right? But like, I don't get it. How does he decide, okay, I'm sticking with this part of like the establishment, but I'm throwing away this part, or I'm adding on my own version of it. It's just kind of interesting how it works. Whereas again, the purists would say, well, no, we don't accept any of it. Academia needs to go down, like the Harvards, the Yales, or whatever. This is all the deep state shit. Whereas Brett Weinstein would say, well, I mean, it is the deep state, but again, like some of the theories actually are true. Okay. So
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what makes him select some aspects and dismiss others as you're describing. I'm not familiar with his
Yeah, but
set of denials.
absolutely. But what is interesting, though, on that is someone who I suppose dismisses, maybe something that, the consensus would agree is maybe a crazy idea, but then introduce, their own, whatever are their own ideas.
right.
I don't know. I actually feel almost compelled also to listen to a person like that. Not that I should, but that's interesting. I do feel that in myself
Like
where
the
I'm like,
renegade, right?
well, no, I'm
Yeah.
just saying, like, for example, if someone says, these, they say something like, these conspiracy theorists, they just want some kind of narrative, to create some kind of narrative, but it's not based in fact. Or if it is, it's exaggerated facts, or say something. They say something like that, and that kind of grabs your attention. You're like, okay, I agree with that. And then they start to introduce whatever is their
Mhm.
own
Right.
thought process or idea. You start to be like, well, all right, I mean, the way he just framed that these ideas are crazy,
Yeah.
I can get with that. Okay, what's this new thing he's saying or she's saying? Okay, I'm going to listen to that more now.
Right, right.
And not that you should, but I'm just saying,
No,
like,
but yeah, but that I think is the Bert Weinstein method, man. I think because he has like some aura of credibility when he debunks other shit that, like, obviously loony stuff. People are like, yeah, well, I mean, he's an evolutionary biologist. Like, this is an intellectual. So, okay, but I do want to now, Robin, go back to your grandfather. So here's the question that I would ask you. So when he sent you all those videos, right? So, and this is now we're really getting into argumentation. So how do you take that seriously? So from what we learned from other guests is that, like, okay, you have to take some of this stuff seriously because, I mean, if you're just gonna, dismiss the person, I mean, they're not gonna want to talk to you, obviously. But then also, we only have so much time in the day, and then on top of that, we also don't want to really validate too much of this stuff, even by just giving it attention. So how did you handle that? So what happened? So he sent you all these videos, and you're like, okay, what am I doing with this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I generally would watch them, and even today when I have family members who send me things, I'll watch them. I mean, and it kind of, I guess, in some ways connects to what you were just talking about, your own experiences with feeling like somehow a door gets wedged open for you when somebody says something that you agree with. I mean, rhetoricians also know that's how it works. Like you can't reach any kind of agreement without first establishing some foundational shared agreements, even if the agreement is that this is something worth talking about, right? Even if it's as slim as that. Any kind of later agreement, any kind of later understanding that could be reached really has to build from some kind of solid foundation. So that might actually help to explain like why that seems to be rhetorically effective for you. Rhetoricians are really good at trying to gain some future agreement by first starting with, baiting the hook in a way, by getting you to agree with some preliminary things. And so I think, I mean, in some ways, it's sort of, I feel as somebody who studies rhetoric, but also just as a person who's in relationships with people who we see the world just so differently. It's important to try to understand where people are coming from and try to understand, or at least try to get inside of how the rhetoric is working and understand why it's so compelling and effective and persuasive for some people. So, like, I mean, one of the things I talk about in the book is famous video of the PDF layers coming off of Obama's long-form birth certificate from the birther controversy. So my dad sent me an email years ago when that first started circulating and said, this looks very real. As you were just saying, this is very convincing to me. This looks very real to me. This seems super convincing to me. And I mean, what I was seeing was, in my dad's email, it was an image of an image of an image of an image of an image, right? Because it's like an image in my dad's email of an image that he saw online, of an image of somebody doing Photoshop, of an image that had been scanned, right? So for me, I'm seeing like all of these layers, and it's important. It's important for me to understand that somebody like my dad, what he sees when he sees these images that float across his screen is like, for him, it's the thing itself, right? So I have to be aware of that. Like, one of the ways that rhetoric is so effective on some people is they aren't thinking about all those layers of mediation, on all those layers of representation, because the screen gives us this false sense of actuality. It gives us this false sense of having some kind of access to reality. So I mean, that's how I handle it. I engage with it. I engage with it not to look for what I disagree with in it, but to try to understand, why was this convincing to him? Part of the reason it's convincing is because it's telling him something he wants to believe, right? And so, I mean, the first step for all of this is to be aware of what it is that we're wanting to believe, and to be kind of dubious of the things that we're wanting to believe. But at the same time, like, I mean, I'm also just curious and I'm interested. I'm curious and interested about what makes people believe things, and what makes people want beyond just the initial, it's something I would like to believe. So yeah, I think it's not easy to do, though. Sometimes I receive things that are just almost like nauseating to watch, and I'm not exaggerating. The arguments can be so distressing and upsetting and so harmful.
Yeah.
But I feel like that's my job. It's my job as a rhetorician to understand how it's working, why it's working. And also just to realize, like, with compassion, that there are people who are being led around by the nose by these things, by these thinkers. And not everybody really truly believes the rhetoric they're producing. I mean, I'm not the person to tell you who believes it and who doesn't, but only they themselves can know, but there are people who are being manipulated and lied to, and it's worrying to me. Like it's upsetting to me. And so what kind of a rhetorician would I be if I just refuse to engage, or refuse to try to understand it, or refuse to study it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I could, sorry, is it, all right. So I could, by the way, totally relate to that sort of, to wanting to understand, especially like if it's somebody in your family who believes maybe something alternative to what you do, or not, or let's say they're extreme in their views, right? I can get behind that. I do want to understand, why do they think what they do? Because in their head, they think they're right, or there is something true about what it is that they're being told or that they're looking into. And the thing is, I have also like a sort of a feeling of compassion for them too. It not because I think, oh, I'm correct and they're wrong and they're being led by the nose. It's fine. I could be wrong as well. It's just that, um, even being aware of our own human nature and just how we can easily be led by the nose, so to speak, to think all kinds of different
That's
things.
empathy. Yeah.
Yeah, like, instead of wanting to argue with them and tell them why they're wrong, kind of understanding why they are thinking what they think, at least by engaging with that, you can have productive conversation and understanding. The polarization, all that's going to do by arguing is going to kind of just push both people in, or two or more people rather, into these opposite extremes, and then foster that division. And actually, this is something I was thinking I wanted to ask you before. So, comment followed by a question. So this is in an age of in the age of misinformation and disinformation, right? How can say that we can detect um, that there are certain rhetorical techniques being used, right? Now, there are good actors and bad actors who can use rhetorical techniques. How can we sort of learn to discern what to, I suppose, accept, uh, being that, like, especially now that we have like deep fakes, you have all these different things. I think it's way worse than that Obama PDF. It's going to be even more convincing. Videos of politicians maybe giving a speech that people will think that actual politician gave that speech, and maybe that is not the case. How do we sort of navigate that?
Well, I mean, as somebody who studies rhetoric, I can't tell you what to accept.
Yeah,
I can only tell you what kind of process needs to be in place before you accept anything at all.
that's fair.
And that,
Yeah.
so it's a slightly different goal, right? But here's what I can say. I mean, I think that in our cultural moment, what I observe is that there is almost like an anxious rush to figure out what I think I believe, or what I think is true, or
Mhm.
what I am going to accept. And I feel like that goal is misplaced. So one of the reasons I wrote my book is that I feel like we are far too hasty to latch on to beliefs in a time and in the midst of an explosion of media that's making belief much more fraught and more difficult. In other words,
Mhm.
it should be much harder for us to believe in the bewildering world with the profusion of media formats that we have. It should be much harder for us to latch on to beliefs. And yet what's happening seems to be the opposite, that we're much more hastily and incautiously latching onto beliefs, almost in a kind of reaction formation against
Mm.
the bewilderment, against the difficulty, against the profusion of media.
Hmm.
And I think what needs to happen instead is it needs to be harder for us to figure out, or to say, yeah, this is proven to be true as far as I'm concerned. This I know, this I think is reliable. This I believe. That time span needs to be longer. It needs to be more careful. The more media we have, the more, as you're pointing out, all these examples, deep fakes and whatnot. And yet that's not our response. Our response seems to be to try to speed up the process of latching onto beliefs. So as a rhetorician, what I would say is the aim is to subject any belief to as much doubt as possible, using every tool in your toolkit to subject it to as much disbelief as possible before you decide, okay, this seems to have withstood every doubt I can muster. And the tradition of rhetoric is full of ways of testing ideas and testing language and figuring out why I'm being provoked to want to believe it. The procedure needs to be focusing not on how quickly can I get from point A not knowing to point B believing. The goal needs to be how many more hurdles can I put between myself and believing that thing out there that's compelling me, that makes me want to believe it, that sounds so convincing, that sounds so true, that sounds so reasonable.
Oh, I love that. So
Very quickly, no, I definitely appreciate that. That's actually something that I do. I just noticed that in my own personal life, I tend to actually, it's not that I don't accept any piece of information that's presented, whether it's in the media or what have you. It's just that I kind of am, for example, if I hear something from, I don't know, CNN or Fox, about, I don't know, Israel, Palestine, I'm being random, not trying to get too deep into this, but essentially, I'll hear a piece of news and then I will kind of hold that piece of information sort of up in the air and not necessarily attach myself to it, because I know that if I was going to present one of those pieces of information in discourse, uh, it could either be met with just argument or or maybe I just haven't done enough research or something like that. So I tend to like have these sort of beliefs like hanging in the air. And I notice myself do that more and more these days as far as and digesting any piece of information from the media, especially knowing that it could be misinformation. And so I don't know. I guess probably that's the origin of my asking that, because I just noticed that I find it harder and harder to sort of come to a point of, I don't know, integrating all the facts in order to have the most balanced view. Um, but I definitely I like what you said. I definitely at least giving the time to sort of allow yourself to figure it out. Don't be hasty trying to solve the tension and come to some sort of a decision where you stand. Um, that makes a lot of sense to
can I
me.
add on to that?
Please.
Okay, so I now have a kind of a tough question challenge for you, Robin. Okay, so going back to your dad, right? So, okay, what you're talking about is being a good actor, right? So I want to actually cite somebody who was on our show who is so just a phenomenal person. I mean, just does a lot of great work. He's a philosopher, Andy Norman. I think the project is called Cersei. So yeah, that's what I kind of got
The
stuck on.
mental immunity
Yeah, the
project.
mental immunity project, right. But I think yeah, it's Cersei. So yeah, so with Andy Norman, the way he conceptualizes is he says, look, like we should doubt everything, right? Exactly what the both of you are saying. But at some point, he's like, look, there has to be a pivot point where you accept the belief as fundamentally established. And then at some point, we ask, okay, well, why would you doubt it? So there's this flip that happens. So it starts from, okay, how do we know? How do we know? How do we know? And then at some point, there's a threshold. Again, there's a flip. And then it's like, well, why would you doubt that? Right. So, okay, but with somebody like your dad, right? So now the both of you are good faith actors. So, Robin, you're like, hey, I'm going to watch all of this garbage, right? It sucks, but I respect you and I want to help you change your mind, or at the very least, I want to learn, and I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. I believe that you believe this stuff, and I'm going to consume all this information. And then at some point, right, you're debunking one video, two videos, three videos, four videos. And then you're like, hey, dude, okay, when is this pivot going to happen? Like, when is it that you're going to finally say, like, hey, first of all, maybe watch some of my videos, but then on top of that, where does this pivot happen where you're like, hey, maybe I shouldn't believe this anymore? So, like, what do we do with those people? What happens when you both are acting in good faith, but the other person is like, well, here's an excuse, here's a justification, here's why you're wrong, or whatever. They're kind of like using these rhetorical tools to essentially weasel out of it. So rather than saying something like, oh, well, I could see that this is established, it's like, well, we can't really believe everything that the scientists say. They disagree. Well, you just found that on the internet, whatever it is, whatever excuse that a person wants to use, right? How do we continue to take people seriously when, even though, yes, you're giving them the time of day and the space to watch all of their stuff, they're really not doing that for you. They're not fair thinkers.
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, I keep coming back to this, but I'm a rhetorician. I don't look into people's hearts and minds. I'm not a soothsayer, right? That's not what I do. That's not what my job is. What I do is I study language, and I even study the language of people who are saying something that I believe to be false I even study the language of people who are saying something I believe to be false, and they know they're saying something they believe to be false, and they're being deliberately duplicitous. I'm still interested in how their language is functioning. I'm still interested in what kind of persuasive tools they're trying to use. And in the case of somebody who, and I mean, I don't think I'm a Pollyanna. I'm actually a pretty negative person. If you knew me, you would know this. But I do think that most of the people that when I really listen and I really pay attention, most people, not all, but most people really do seem to believe the things that they are saying are true.
Right.
Even some of the most kind of nefarious actors in the post-truth misinformation world, a lot of them really believe the things that they're peddling. And so I can't answer as I can't answer as anything other than somebody who studies language and persuasion to say that I'm still interested in how the persuasion is working. I mean, I think what Alan, what you were just describing of your own experience, I think it's unusual for us today to create that moment of like suspending judgment, to use the analytical and critical tools that we have to withhold judgment for as long as possible. It makes us uncomfortable. I don't think that's a new phenomenon, right? The opening line of Aristotle's Metaphysics is all humans by nature desire to know. It is a strong drive to want to know, to latch on to knowledge. And what tools like rhetoric were invented for, not just rhetoric, but philosophy and logic, they were invented to capacitate that withholding of judgment, testing ideas, taking the time to test their mettle, to see how worthy of belief they are. And I guess for me, there are very few things that I feel like I would claim to know with a kind of certainty, and most of them are really within a very narrow area of expertise. All the rest is really, as Aristotle would say, it's probably probability. We can only really make judgments on a very like probabilistic and contingent nature. And so for that reason, it's only appropriate to withhold judgment as much as possible for as long as possible. So maybe I'm wrong. Perhaps we do have to commit to judgment on certain issues, but I think those issues are probably narrower than we imagine that they are.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because I mean, most people would say like, okay, obviously vaccine mandates would be up there. Politically, let's say nefarious actors like stealing elections, maybe that could be another thing that's up there. Yeah, because I mean, I always wonder like, what do you do with people who really aren't? So going back to the Michael Shermer comment where he's like, well, you can't really argue with RFK Jr. because he argues to win, so he's not a fair thinker. Meaning, if you tell him like, hey, here's why you're wrong, he's just going to give you 10 million reasons. Well, he didn't say this. I'm saying this. He's going to give you 10 million reasons why you're the one who's wrong, right? Because he's skilled in kind of the art of persuasion, and he's able to kind of divert his audience away from the actual problem. So, okay, when we get into the actual, let's say, techniques or skills or the tools that these people use, so what are the most common ones?
Are you asking about like the skills that the rhetorical skills that people use in order to promote misinformation?
Yes.
So one I've mentioned already is fact denial. That's the most consistent one in what we would term a misinformation, disinformation, or conspiracy theory, knocking down facts. But it's not only that. I mean, another is, so rhetoric makes a distinction between different genres of speaking on the basis of what a speech or a piece of rhetoric is trying to get you to do. And there are a lot of like pseudo news sources that seem as though, and they're meant to project the impression that what they're trying to do, their aim, their purpose is merely to inform. But one thing you notice about many of the outlets that are peddlers of mis and disinformation is that they're not actually trying to inform at all. And you can actually tell pretty much on the surface just by paying attention to how much intense value-laden language they use. They're not really trying to inform, they're trying to tell you what to think, not just what happened or what is the case or something that occurred, but what to think about what occurred or how to respond to what occurred. So value-laden language is something to look for. It's something to pay attention to. And especially when it's value-laden language that's leading to really only one kind of conclusion or one kind of emotional response. Another one.
I'm sorry, can you just get into that a little bit? What is value-laden language?
So let's talk about like Alex Jones and Alex Jones's response to the Sandy Hook school shooting, which led to a nearly decade-long conspiracy theory that this shooting never happened, the parents were crisis actors, that it was all staged by the US government as an excuse to pass stricter gun laws. Alex Jones's site looks like a news site. It mimics, it has, you know, the same kind of links running across the top header. It pretends to have like author bylines on its articles. But when you pay attention to the language it's using, it's not saying, oh, a shooting didn't happen today in Sandy Hook. It's saying this is another extreme lie by the far left government to try to rip guns out of our hands by hook or by crook, right? So there's all this like intense value-laden language that's telling us what to think about this so-called event, right? Or what they're calling a so-called event. Values generally, not just value-laden language, but values generally are roundly exploited. What I mean by values as opposed to value-laden language is there's certain high ideals that, just believe it or not, despite the fact that we disagree about so many political issues, we share countless values in common. We value peace, we value security, we value loyalty, we value love, we value freedom. Mm-hmm. So one of the ways you can spot manipulation happening is when values are highlighted in such a way that are a misfit for what's being discussed. One of the examples I offer in the book is that my dad was persuaded by a number of pundits and talking heads to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on incandescent light bulbs when they were getting phased out. I mean, he actually got intensely angry about the fact that incandescent light bulbs were being phased out. And this is a person who I just, like, in my wildest imagination, I couldn't have ever imagined my dad giving a damn about light bulbs. But somehow somebody ramped him up and got him to care about light bulbs. And I did the research to figure out like what he was watching and what he was viewing and what he was reading. And I found all kinds of articles that were saying they're trying to take away your freedom, right? Your liberty. Yeah. Is liberty relevant in the case of buying light bulbs? Is freedom relevant in the context of buying light bulbs? It to me, no. And I think really to anybody, to my dad, if he'd taken a moment just to ask himself that question, like what value matters most in purchasing light bulbs? I mean, he was somebody who did not like to pay high electric bills. He would have valued cost, right? He would have valued efficiency. But the rhetoric worked, right? So anytime somebody's highlighting a value, and not only if that value is a misfit to the context it's being applied in, but also if it's being treated like an absolute value, like there's just no other value in the world. Cost is not a value. Efficiency is not a value. Only freedom is a value. Well, then, yeah, you're being manipulated. That's the manipulation happening. And so, I'm not hesitant to say that, you know, talking heads on news shows that are taking money from super PACs that represent the energy companies, right? Like, yeah, there's money changing hands behind the scenes that's getting somebody like my dad to believe his freedom's at stake on the basis of what light bulb he screws into a light fixture.
Yeah, so what I'm noticing here, and this might be very on the nose, but essentially, if, for example, you're reading a headline and it says like keywords, they are taking your and then freedom value, and then they're separating they, making other, you're just kind of putting that division between you and this other entity, and then inserting a value into that statement, or into that statement essentially. That's how they're sort of getting you right away if you don't catch it.
Yeah. So
I think that the us versus them thinking is rife for sure. And I mean, that's a major problem today. The fact that so much rhetoric, and not just rhetoric on the right, but rhetoric on the right and the left, is causing us to see our like main division, our main us versus them, our main good guys versus bad guys as our fellow citizens, right? Who have an investment in making sure that our society and our structures of governance work for all the people that are governed in the state, that work for all the citizens. So yeah, the us versus them thinking kind of cuts across so much of it. But I think what I'm in this example trying to highlight is values at the opposite of facts. And in fact, we have a tendency to think that facts are the things that have the staying power, and yet values, well, those are like malleable, those are subjective. In rhetoric, it's the reverse. Rhetoric means that facts can get knocked down just by being denied, but values, I mean, who doesn't think freedom's important, right? So all of a sudden, like if somebody's introduced freedom into their rhetoric, no matter what it is, it's going to garner some agreement. It's going to get some attention. And you can't just say, well, freedom doesn't matter. I can't tell my dad, well, dad, freedom doesn't matter, right? Because he thinks freedom is the most important thing that there is. What I have to do instead is say, well, it's not the only thing that matters, right? And it's not necessarily the most important thing in this one context, although it might be in another context. That becomes the ground for the conversation.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and I was going to say, so I'm sorry because I cut you off. So you were going to say the other techniques.
Oh, I mean, there are so many. Read the book. Read the book. There are numerous.
Yeah, because you were going to list a few more as like we were going to start like wrapping up. So, okay. But technically I asked you what were the most important ones or what were the most like sort of prominent ones that you saw? So you had the value-laden language. Was there any other ones that you wanted to mention?
Denying facts was a big one.
Facts, denying facts, value-laden language, values, what in rhetoric we call it a value hierarchy, right? When freedom becomes the most important thing and nothing else matters, or cost is treated as so minimal, the technique then is to ask, okay, so then what's being subordinated, what's being lessened? But then obviously the manipulation of emotions, like any rhetoric that causes, I mean, that's one of the easiest things to begin to spot. It's a good starting place. Because we can feel the emotions that well up in our bodies, right? We can feel it when something is making us angry or agitated or fearful. Aristotle was the first person in the Western tradition to notice how effective that was at manipulating people. He realized that when people feel negative emotions, when they feel emotions like fear and anger, they're much more likely to act. They're much more likely to take action. And lo and behold, what do we find when we find effective rhetoric? We often find it exploiting negative emotions like fear and like anger. Anytime somebody says something that provokes us to feel fear and anger, we should think about what in the language made us feel that way and question, why did it work so well? What was so effective about it? And not assume that it's just that what they said is true, but try to pay attention to how the language provoked that effect in the first place. Aristotle also noted something that we now know to be true. He noted it over 2,000 years ago that we enjoy feeling negative emotions. This is something brain science has now found, that it actually works as addictive as gambling and cocaine, right? We latch onto those negative ideas and emotions. And so if we're much more likely to act precipitously and we want to feel negative emotions, well, then again, that's where rhetoric needs to come into play, as this sort of synapse to make us question, well, why is it making us feel this way? One of the reasons it works so well is because, as I was mentioning, because it feels like it's welling up inside of us, it feels so real, right? Why would I feel this feeling welling up inside of me? And in a sense, it is real, right? Because it's physically happening to us. We're physically being affected. It's one of the reasons that Aristotle called it a form of proof, pathos, right? It feels as though something has been proven to be the case.
Right. And that's so fascinating. Yeah. So I would even say a little bit further, I would say it's not just the lows, it's also the highs, and the fact that people feel effective, the fact that they feel like they have purpose, and also the fact that they're doing something significant, not only for themselves and their communities. So just even feeling that anger and anxiety well up and then managing it, or managing it effectively, where like a Trump could say, oh, okay, cool. If you guys don't want to be anxious, get rid of all the immigrants. Everybody's like, yes, we figured it out. We figured out a way to help ourselves. And so, yeah, that's such a powerful thing. I mean, people literally go to therapy for this stuff, where it's like, yeah, obviously, they're going to say, well, I don't really love feeling, really sad and obviously really anxious, but just overcoming that session after session, the highs of it. So my patients have said this 10 million times, where they were like, yeah, man, like every time we have like a good session where it seems like, okay, I come in and I'm really wound up, and then I start to feel some relief, and it feels like I did that. Like, it's like euphoric almost. So I find that that's what seems like, at least in those rallies, like you get this energy of euphoria, like across the board. And it's like this sort of bound up, like negative energy is all of a sudden released, and people are like, yes, we fucking did it. And again, there's meaning and there's significance, and it all fucking matters. And life is just like this magical thing. So yeah, I would say that's probably one of the main reasons why people are addicted to negative emotions, because again, there's so much that you could do with that. Whereas like, with boredom, I mean, technically boredom is a negative emotion, but it's much harder to feel like there's some sort of purpose. Whereas like with fight or flight, again, it's safety, it's protection, obviously. There's again the community involved. Like there's so much more to it than that, than just kind of like, soaking in the sun and feeling like, oh, life is really good and I don't really know what I'm gonna do tomorrow or whatever. So yeah, this is great. Wow. I would say that that's probably the most fascinating part of your book, the emotional aspect of it, because emotions, man, oh my God, they literally have a life of their own at times. So
Yeah, I mean, it almost sounds like you've been reading Aristotle. Aristotle says it functions exactly that way in rhetoric. Somebody will say something to make you feel afraid or make you feel angry, and they will then immediately offer you some hope of refuge if you're feeling afraid, or some promise of revenge if you're feeling angry. And it makes that hope of rescue and that promise of revenge so much more rhetorically powerful because the emotion was ignited in the first place. It almost creates the receptors for the thing it's trying to argue for.
yeah, wow, I love that. Okay, Alan, as we start to wrap up, final questions for Robin.
Yes. If we wanted to follow you, follow your work, and of course, buy the book, where can we do that?
I'm not on social media, so just buy the book.
I love it. Amazon or
Uh,
whatever else I
we'll
assume.
we'll
Yeah,
post the link in the
Okay.
description.
yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Absolutely.
All right,
It's available for
yeah.
pre-order on Amazon, I noticed. So
It is,
I'll
and
definitely.
it'll be out in just what, a little more than 2 weeks. So right around the corner.
I
Yeah.
love it. Robin, thank you so much,
This
man.
was
This was such a
awesome.
fascinating perspective on the topic. Because, like I said, we covered it so many times where I'm like, okay, we're doing another episode on misinformation. But yeah, man, a lot of that stuff, especially related to ancient Greek theoretical, I guess, whatever, theories of persuasive speaking. Yeah, this one we haven't covered yet. So thank you again so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for your time and your
Absolutely.
interest.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Have a good night. We'll talk to you soon.
Take
Okay.
care. All right. That was cool. So, everyone, if you like this episode, you can follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, on Twitter, where it's Seize_podcast. Like, subscribe, hit the bell on YouTube. And again, thank you so much for watching and see you next time.